Oh. All right, let's dive right back into it. The Power of Your Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy. Practical Techniques of Mental Healings. We're almost done with this chapter. Unbelievable. I hope you know what I'm talking about. Just want to mention that before we dive into this. If you get it, you get it. And if you don't, you don't. I don't know if that sounds flippant or crass. I don't mean it to, but like I mentioned in a recent video, I often feel like I'm speaking a different language compared to most people talking about these ideas. And it's not that I am a master in applying them or that I know something other people don't or anything like that. It's just that I have a spiritual perspective on this stuff that I had, I had a spiritual perspective before I got into these manifesting ideas, into these ideas that Joseph Murphy's about to talk about. And I lovingly question, whether most people have a spiritual perspective of this stuff. Because I think if they did, they would look at it differently. And I wonder how many people watching this understand what I'm saying. I know that some of you do. And I also know that a lot of you don't. In which case, what I'm saying probably makes little sense and offends you, and that's okay. And, a practical application of the spiritual perspective of life, I think, is really explained well in Law of Attraction teachings. Even when someone's not using spiritual language like Kuei, there's like this spiritual undercurrent. And the power of, one could say, your imagination is explained in such a beautiful and harmonizing way. And someone else, obviously, who did this really well is Joseph Murphy and Phineas Parker's Quimby, who we're going to touch upon again today. We talked about Quimby the other day. As I mentioned, he's really one of the huge yet really underrated figures in American spiritual history, really, you could say. Certainly in this whole mental, spiritual healing world of which we still live in, of which, Law of Attraction, Law of Assumption is basically just modern terms for mental and spiritual healing. And Quimby, you could look at him as almost the founding father of that in the United States. So in this section of the chapter, it's called The Cripple Walks, and Murphy writes, Dr. Phineas Parker's Quimby, of whom we spoke previously in this chapter, used the absolute method in the latter years of his healing career. He was really the father of psychosomatic medicine and the first psychoanalyst. He had the capacity to diagnose clairvoyantly the cause of the patient's troubles, pains, and aches. The following is a condensed account of the healing of a cripple as recorded in Quimby's manuscripts. Quimby was called on to visit a woman who was lame, aged, and bedridden. He states that her ailment was due to the fact that she was imprisoned by a creed so small and contracted that she cannot stand upright and move about. You're going to hear, I think, the recycle truck in the background, so it's going to give some real juice to this video. Murphy continues about this patient that she was living in the tomb of fear and ignorance. Furthermore, she was taking the Bible literally, and it frightened her. Now, before we think of this as like an antiquated, old-fashioned story, recognize that today when people read about the law of assumption, read about the law of attraction, read about manifesting principles, read about stuff like that, what Neville says, they, just like this woman, take it very, very literally. And it can entrap them a lot of the time and not free them and make them feel better, but actually make them feel worse. That happens very often. So don't look at this as like an old-fashioned story from the 19th century. This is a relevant story that Murphy's relating. In this tomb, Quimby said, was the presence and power of God trying to burst the bands. break through the bonds, and rise from the dead. When she would ask others for an explanation of some passage of the Bible, the answer would be a stone. Then she would hunger for the bread of life. Dr. Quimby diagnosed her case as a mind cloudy and stagnated due to excitation and fear, caused by the inability to see clearly the meaning of the passage of the Bible which she had been reading. Again, this is not any different than people today when they're having trouble applying these principles, reading Neville and getting more confused, feeling more lost and agitated and excited, than liberated by reading and applying the principles he talks about and other law of attraction, law of assumption teachers talk about. Here comes the recycling truck, just on time. Murphy goes on to write that Quimby's patient, this showed itself in the body by her heavy and sluggish feeling, which would terminate as paralysis. So in other words, she was so fearful that she had basically caused herself to be paralyzed. Another byproduct of this can be agoraphobia, where people are afraid to leave the house. They're so scared of everything. They're scared to open their front door. As Coué often said, when people are in states like this, when we get to be like this, it's like we make mountains out of molehills. So Murphy is relating the story of what Quimby did. He writes, at this point, Quimby asked her what was meant in the Bible verses, yet a little while am I with you, and then I go unto him that sent me. Ye shall seek me, and shall not find me. And where I am, thither ye cannot come. That's John 7:33-34. She, the woman, replied that it meant Jesus went to heaven. Quimby explained what it really meant by telling her that being with her a little while meant his explanation of her symptoms, feelings, and their causes was him being there for a little while, his explanation, i.e., he had compassion and sympathy for her momentarily, but he cannot remain in that mental state with her. Quimby would not remain in that state where he was, lamenting her pains. He wouldn't do it. He could only be with her for a little while, lamenting with her. The next step was to go to him that sent us, which, as Quimby pointed out, was the creative power of God in all of us. This links back to the absolute method, which we touched upon yesterday. Quimby immediately traveled in his mind and contemplated the divine ideal. Again, linking to the absolute method. The divine ideal, i.e., the vitality, intelligence, harmony, and power of God functioning in the sick person. This is why he said to the woman, therefore, where I go, you cannot come, for you are in your narrow, restricted belief, and I am in health. One who recognizes God is in health. As they say, to paraphrase, you recognize God, you're a majority of one. You're just to recognize God is enough, right? It's like the essence of the absolute method. Murphy writes that Quimby's prayer and explanation produced an instantaneous sensation, and a change came over this woman's mind. She walked without her crutches. Quimby said it was one of the most singular of all his healings. She was, as it were, dead to error, and to bring her to life or truth was to raise her from the dead. Quimby quoted the resurrection of Christ and applied it to her own Christ or health. This produced a powerful effect on her. Again, this is like linking it with the absolute method. Quoting the resurrection of Christ and then applying it to her own Christ, the Christ within. This is what H.M. Lee Cady explains really well, is how we can do this in our own lives, recognizing our own Christ within, or health. which is the same thing as health. It's that divine ideal, health, vitality, intelligence, harmony, the power of God functioning within us, okay? Quimby also explained to her that the truth which she accepted was the angel or idea which rolled away the stone of fear, ignorance, and superstition, thereby releasing the healing power of God which made her whole. And this healing power of God was there the whole time. And again, vitality, intelligence, harmony. We don't have to necessarily use spiritual terms. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that this healing power of God, if we want to use more psychological terms, we could just say it's our imagination. It's our consciousness recognizing truth and freeing itself. This is what Coué did, and would, how he would describe it. He would say your imagination can either hinder you as you create fear thoughts and fear patterns in your mind, in your subconscious, or it can free you by thinking properly, imagining properly. This is also, of course, what Neville later talked about. Coué, again, had crazy stories like this about healing, quote unquote, healing a cripple. Coué did this quite often. Not every time that he'd, meet with people, but there's so many miraculous stories of Coué healing people who seemingly were crippled or, incredibly weak and frail, and then them all of a sudden jumping up and down, running, walking. And people would say, these are miracles. And Coué would say, I don't believe in miracles. Coué did not actually believe in miracles. I'll link above again. I linked to it, I think, yesterday as well. The video talking about Coué's miracles and how he didn't actually believe in miracles, and how he said, like, when you heal someone from paralysis, or when it's really them, first of all, it's them healing themselves. You don't heal them. You facilitate. You show them that it's their imagination causing them their paralysis. And then they just have to convince themselves that they're okay. And if they physically have healed, but mentally think they are not okay, they're still going to be crippled in some significant way. But if you convince them that, physically, let's see what happens. Your body's probably healed, at least to some significant degree. You just think it has not. If you convince yourself that it has healed, you're going to be able to walk again. And so, Coué would talk about how people assumed that they were paralyzed, or that they were going to be have crutches the rest of their life, a wheelchair, whatever. In reality, it was that belief, that false fear and belief, which kept them in crutches, in a wheelchair or whatever. It kept them bedridden and sick. And that if they simply recognize the healing power within themselves, that their imagination, the spiritual term would be God, if they recognized that and thought it, that they were getting better and better, and that they were healthy, and that they were stronger than they thought, and that everything was getting better, and that they could actually walk and move and regain their health, they would regain their health. Coué said that's not a miracle. That's just how life works. Fascinating stuff. If you have any questions, radicalcounselor.com. I'm right now just beginning to offer special holiday coaching sessions at reduced rates. So check it out if you're interested, and I will talk to you again soon. We're getting near the end of this chapter.